Hi everyone, Mike Malatesta here, and welcome back to the How Did Happen podcast. On this podcast, I dig in deep with every guest to explore the roots of their success, to discover not just how it happened, but why it matters. My mission is to find and share stories that inspire, activate, and maximize the greatness in you. On today's episode, I'm talking with Kelly Richmond Pope. Kelly is a professor, an author, a filmmaker, and a fraud expert. We talk about her desire to turn fraud upside down, how anyone can be talked into anything under the right circumstances, what's the deal with how we treat whistleblowers, and much more. We also talk about Brett Johnson, a reformed cyber criminal who's featured in her new book and was also on episode 370 and 372 of the podcast. So please go check out those episodes as well.
What I wanted to do with the book is sort of turn fraud upside down. This is something that we all have the propensity to do. When I started thinking about how people are so easy to say it's them, not me, I started to think about how can I change this conversation a little bit so that people can see themselves reflected in these types of unethical decisions that sometimes people can make.
Kelly is a great storyteller, a great teacher, and a great talent. I know you'll enjoy this conversation. Hi, Kelly. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me today.
I've been very, very, very excited about this for a month and a half, I'd say, since the first time I heard you and the first time I heard about your book, which I picked up and read and consumed over spring break trip. And yeah, it's like you guys are in for a treat, as I mentioned in the intro, because Kelly, not only is she an expert in all things fraud, but she is a very dynamic person, and you're going to get a lot out of this. So before we go further, let me tell you a little bit more about Dr. Kelly Richmond Pope. She is the Dr. Barry J. Epstein Endowed Professor of Forensic Accounting at DePaul University in Chicago. She is a nationally recognized expert in risk, forensic accounting, and white-collar crime research. And who isn't interested in white-collar crime research, right?
Everybody.
I mean, the Wall Street Journal loves a story like that, right? It just has it's got a lot of, life to it. Everybody loves those stories. Yeah. So, and an award-winning educator, researcher, author, and award-winning documentary filmmaker as well. Kelly teaches managerial and forensic accounting, both at the undergraduate and graduate level. And when she's not in the classroom, Kelly's engaged in fraud and white-collar crime research. She loves films and always dreamed of having the ability to merge accounting with filmmaking, and she did so in her documentary, which is called All the Queen's Horses, which we will definitely talk about today. Kelly's TED Talk, entitled How Whistleblowers Shape History, has been viewed more than 1.6 million times. Congratulations.
Thanks.
Translated into 20 languages and serves as a resource to help organizations and individuals embrace internal whistleblowing. Kelly's new book, Fool Me Once: Scams, Stories, and Secrets from the $1 Trillion Fraud Industry, is amazing. If I open this up, you would see that I've got tons of bookmarks and underlines, which I then made into an Otter recording so that I could just read all of my notes out of here and then put them all together. It was, and I've never done that for a book before. So something about your book made me want to do that. So the book's amazing and has greatly broadened her stage. If you follow her on LinkedIn or social media, she is speaking all over the world with cases and cases of books that she's giving out and signing as well. So, it's been I'm sure it's been a great experience, and we're going to talk more about that. Kelly's passions are fraud, film, and lifelong learning. And you can learn more about Kelly at kellyrichmondpope.com. So Kelly, I start every podcast with the same simple question, and that is, how did it happen for you?
Mm-hmm. So the operative word is it. What it are we talking about? Are we talking about the it of fraud? Or are you talking about the it of writing, the it of being a filmmaker, the it of being a professor, or what's the it?
A mom?
A mom, yeah. Well, that's a whole nother podcast.
We're not going to get into that yet. We're going to put that it to the side for today, maybe.
But maybe the it is, how did I get interested in this field?
Yeah.
Maybe that's the it. We'll start with that one.
Let's start with that.
And I think for me, what I started to notice as a professional, accounting academic, is when I would go to conferences, and the people knew at the time that I would do these on-camera interviews with white-collar felons, whistleblowers, and victims of fraud. But it was the white-collar felon interviews that people would come like, oh, we want to see those fraudsters.
Yeah.
And it was when people would say things like that would sort of get to me, because I would say to myself, it's not them, it's us. This is something that we all have the propensity to do. We can all think about some little misstep. Some of us, it's smaller. Some of us, it's larger. And if it's large enough, we'll read about it. But
Right.
all of us can really find ourselves rationalizing why it's okay to make just this little sidestep because it's something that we want. So when I started thinking about how people are so easy to say it's them, not me, I started to think about, like, how can I change this conversation a little bit so that people can see themselves reflected in these types of unethical decisions that sometimes people can make.
Mm-hmm.
So what I wanted to do with the book, at least, is sort of turn fraud upside down. Because especially when we start thinking about the two sort of bookends of the book, which are the fraudsters and the whistleblowers. When we think of the fraudsters, we often think of a certain type of fraudster. I mean, if you're like me, you watch anything true crime, you listen to true crime podcasts, you just can't get enough of it, right? And those stories and those cases tend to be about intentional perpetrators,
Mm-hmm.
people that we tend to not see ourselves anything like. They are inside an organization, they know the loopholes in an organization, and they're able to manipulate an organization for personal gain. And a lot of us don't identify with that. Most of us don't. But there's two other categories that we might identify with. And that's where the book, I think, sort of opens up your mind. And that is the accidental perpetrator and the righteous perpetrator. And so what I wanted to be able to do is allow people to see themselves and sometimes these unethical choices that we make. And so
Mm-hmm.
stop that language of it's them, but make sure that we are more inclusive and we understand it's us.
And when you get into the accidental and righteous perpetrators, let's say, I always think of, and I thought of this when I read your book, that, and I want to see whether you agree with this or not, but it seems to me, in my experience, that anybody at any time with the right persuasion can either be talked into something or talk themselves into something that they would not, that absent that convergence, right time, right person, right message, they would never
Absolutely.
otherwise do. Is that what you, yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so you make such an important point, because I don't think we think about that enough. I don't think we put ourselves in those situations. And what we also don't realize is we find ourselves in those situations that you just described more often than we really recognize.
Right.
So we're in a meeting, we're with the boss, with the CFO, COO, COO, whoever has a C in front of their title. We're there. We need to make the numbers work. We may be trying to IPO. We may be trying to purchase a company. Whatever, there's a pressure that we're trying to manage. And the numbers need to be a certain amount. What can we do to get that number to where we need to be? All hands on deck. We got to fix this problem. And one of the things that we do in organizations is we hire problem solvers. If you think about any really good working employee, any good executive, they are a problem solver. Right. And so sometimes being that problem solver, you almost take a by any means necessary approach to get that problem solved. That might mean cutting corners. That might be relaxing in internal control. And that can lead our organization to significant weaknesses down the road. So yes, what you just said, we all can find ourselves in those circumstances. Right time, right place, right person, right assignment, and boom, we make that decision. And we sort of put the rules, the regulations, our personal ethics, our professional ethics just to the side for a second,
Right.
because we need to get this done right now. And then we'll pick those ethics back up. But for now, we put them down. And so, yes, that's what you said is the point.
I find too that we have a great ability to compartmentalize levels when it comes to what we will and won't do that we wouldn't ordinarily do. For example, if someone were watching us, and I think it's in the book, you have a good example of your own experience where you had something you ordered got delivered to you twice, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you had an ethical dilemma, right? About why don't you tell it? You had an ethical dilemma that I found interesting.
I had a purse by a designer that I really like, and they sent me my purse. I was excited, and then the next day they sent me another purse. I was like, wait a minute, only paid for one. So here I'm just in this dilemma. Now, you think about the thought process, and this comes up. I use this in a lot of workshops. What would you do? Yeah. And a lot of times audiences, accountants, lawyers, professional people. Well, it's not your fault. You didn't order another purse. You should keep it. Keep it and sell it. You didn't ask for it. It's not your problem. They sent it to you. It's on them to figure it out. And I'm like, well, wait a minute. The consumer, the customer also is a level of internal control too. So I have to have some personal ethics about myself to say, hey, wait a minute. You all sent me this. I didn't pay for this. This isn't mine. Right. Most people are like, that's not your fault. And so what I did, I ended up sending the purse back. But what it also could have done is I could have kept the purse. I could have sold the purse. And what if I sold it, made a little bit of money? I'm like, wow, that was easy. I wonder if I could do this again and again and again and again. And then next minute, I got a whole shelf of goods I can sell to people. And I've started into this huge return fraud scheme. Right. And that's how it can start. Just that small.
It's so funny you say that, because as you said that, it reminded me of another person you mentioned in the book who I've had on my podcast twice, Brett Johnson. Because Brett,
he's in my book.
Yeah.
Brett's great.
And Brett Johnson started basically that same way. He ripped somebody off with a Beanie Baby or something.
A Beanie Baby.
Yeah. And then he's like, oh, that was easy. And then, he kept going. And what interested me about the purse thing is, like, someone would say, well, yeah, just keep the purse, Kelly. But if they found somebody's wallet on the street, they would return the wallet, because it's not right to take somebody's wallet. But it's the exact same thing. You came across something that's not yours. You know who it belongs to. So it's not like it's ambiguous at all. And yet there's two people would make two different choices on that just because.
Absolutely. Yesterday in my class, I'm sorry, not yesterday, the day before, we had a guest speaker that came in. His name was Matthew Cox. And Matthew Cox was a real estate fraudster. And we just rehabilitated now. But my students were fascinated by him. And so what he walked through was the kind of fraud that he did. And he said, it's sort of easy. Like, I would create a synthetic identity. And then this synthetic identity would then apply for credit. And they would then apply for a mortgage. And then they would get the mortgage. And then I would, use their credit card, do all kinds of things, take cash advances. It's like, it's pretty easy. And what you find is when you have been exposed to an ethical dilemma and you make the wrong choice, it almost seems like it rewires your mind to think about all the other things that you can rationalize why it's okay.
Right.
And that's the danger.
And let's get back to like when your interest in this first started, because I'm thinking, at least based on what I know and have heard about you and read, normally the type of people, particularly the intentional people, like Brett, for example, he'll tell you, like, this is my choice. I would tell you for a long time it wasn't, but it was my choice. It's intentional. And, that mindset of intentional perpetrators, for example, is so different than yours. So what attracted you to, like, you had a choice. You could be repugnant, repelled by them, or you could be like, I'm really interested in what's going on there, and make a whole not just write a book about, and that's not the whole book, but part of it, but also, start teaching kids, at the college level about all of this stuff instead of basically saying, don't do wrong, bring wrong into the classroom and learn from wrong.
What it really was eye-opening for me was when I was younger, and a neighbor of mine went to federal prison for a mortgage fraud case that he was involved in. And I was in high school, and, when adults act badly and you're a teenager, it sort of hits you differently. You're just sort of like, whoa, like you are acting bad. Like you're the responsible adult. Like, how could you do something like that? So I was old enough to witness this. And, but this neighbor of mine was not an intentional perpetrator. He was actually a righteous perpetrator. He was a person that did not benefit personally. He had power and privilege within his organization and wanted to help a friend. That's a very different motivation than the person that like why Brett did what Brett did, right? Yep. And so when I reflect back on just my research career, I hear myself saying all perpetrators are not created equal. They're not the same. And so how can I allow people to see themselves in a category of perpetrator where they may identify with? And that is the accidental and the righteous perpetrator. So over the years, I have lots of people that come to my class, talk to my students. I go to federal prisons and interview people. I write to people. They write to me. We have these communications. And so what I've learned is how different these categories are. And it makes us empathize very differently. So we can all say a lot of people may dislike Bernard Madoff. He stole from the rich, and that might be the part that we may not care much about, but he still stole from people intentionally. But when you find the person that might steal from their company because they have a child at home sick with cancer, we empathize a little bit differently. We still know they stole, but are they on the same scale with a Bernard Madoff? Probably not. So I wanted people to see themselves in this whole process. So that's, to me, the need for these categories.
So why don't we, if you don't mind, walk through a couple, an example of each? Because you have plenty of examples in the book of an intentional and accidental and righteous, and give people a sense that I think they get, sort of a macro right now. Let's give them a micro on how this really manifests itself in the real world.
All of the book was really inspired by the intentional perpetrator out of my documentary, which was Rita Cronwell.
Yeah.
And Rita Cronwell was a city comptroller, embezzled $53 million. No one knew, did it for 20 years and got arrested. So that story sort of flows through the book. But I'm going to tell you a story about another intentional perpetrator that's going to get to you in a different way. And it's the story of Dr. Robert Courtney. Dr. Robert Courtney was a compound pharmacist. Now, most of us don't know what a compound pharmacist is. When we think about a pharmacist, we think about the pharmacist that's at Walgreens or CVS that we get our medicine and we walk away. But the compound pharmacist is the person that made the medicine, that made the solution, that gives the chemotherapy drugs to the oncologist, and that we don't even think about that person.
Right.
Okay. What Robert Courtney did was he manipulated cancer patient drugs so that he could spread out the margin so that he could pay his tax bill with the IRS and make a donation to his church. Now, just think about this scheme. Now, this is an egregious scheme, but I want you to think about this. If you are a 77-year-old female, stage 4 breast cancer, when you pass away, if you pass away, assuming you pass away, no one may even question it because you're a stage 4, 77-year-old breast cancer patient.
Yeah, and that's just what happens.
It's what happens, right? If you are an 82-year-old male prostate cancer patient and you pass away, no one's going to ask a question. So you think about this type of scheme, sadly, was the perfect scheme because who's going to question when the person passes on? Now, it's sick. Don't get me wrong. This is sick. But what happened was there was a nurse who started to notice my cancer patients aren't showing the normal chemotherapy reactions. So if we polled 100 people on the street today and asked, if somebody is going through chemotherapy, what do you expect them to experience? Nausea, fatigue, hair loss,
weight loss.
Most people expect that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So this nurse started noticing my patients aren't experiencing this. And they're stage 3, stage 4. They should be experiencing. There should be some commonality between all of these patients. And so at first she said, well, she second guesses herself. Everybody responds to chemotherapy differently. Now, yes, but there's some similarity too, right? When my father had cancer, he never went to one treatment that he didn't get sick. Never. Right. And no one in his cohort never walked out of chemotherapy skipping and jumping and ready to go swim laps in the pool. No one did.
My dad neither.
No one ever, right? So she started to get concerned. And what she did is she took a bag of chemotherapy drugs and sent it to the FDA. And when they tested it, it came back. This particular bag had no medication in it. It was just like saline solution.
None. He was really protecting margin.
Oh, yeah. I mean, because think about how you can make that stretch.
Yeah.
And so it just happened that, you may have friends or listeners that work in the pharmaceutical sales industry. And so those pharmaceutical sales reps tend to have relationships with the doctor's offices that they work in. So the nurse was talking to the rep one day and was just like, gosh, we have been so slammed. We're so busy. Dr. Courtney's just patient after patient after patient. And the sales rep's like, how could that be? Because he hasn't been placing a lot of orders, and I know he isn't using another drug. What's up with that? Yeah. So you put 2 and 2 together, and then you do get 4 eventually. And that's how it came to light. So he is an intentional perpetrator. And if you think about it, he had a need. He knew the scheme. He had no oversight. And he knew the likelihood of getting caught was slim. I mean, it was just slim. So he is a very evil kind of intentional perpetrator. And what's interesting, when you start talking about the healthcare field, our disgust for the intentional perpetrators in the healthcare field rise in a different way than when we're just talking about financial statements, money on a sheet. We look at Madoff in a completely different way. Now, were there people that probably had health issues as a result of losing their money? Sure. But this was a little bit different.
Yeah, it's a human and not a thing.
Yeah. So the intentional perpetrator is a person that knows the holes in the system and uses that system to exploit for personal gain.
Let me ask you one question about him.
Sure.
So as you were telling the story, right, when you first started, this thing about paying the IRS back, okay, I get that. But then making a donation to the church, does that sprinkle like a little sociopathic righteousness into that guy's head as well?
It may. A lot of people think when they're doing wrong, if I do a little bit of right, it erases it. And Marianne Jennings has a book called The 7 Signs of Ethical Collapse. And so she talks about, how you can do this type of altruistic kind of move when you're doing something wrong, and that sort of atones for the sins that you're creating. And so sometimes you see that.
You're talking yourself into doing good with doing bad.
Yes, absolutely. That's an intentional perpetrator. Okay. And I use his story as an example because most of us won't identify with him. We'll be like, oh my God, he's terrible. I would never do that. And so I think that's why intentional perpetrators makes for such great TV, because it's wild. The story is wild. The schemes are wild. And they push the envelope in a way that you're just like, wow, I would never do that. Now, the accidental perpetrator, however, and this might be you or me, they're the team player. They're the people pleaser. They're the people that never push back. They believe in the organization. They believe in the executive team. Somebody says, hey, I need you to just sign this document for me. We'll talk about it later. Just sign it so we can get through this process and close this deal. Just sign this. And you do it. You don't push back. You never have said no. And that document that you signed could have just been the document that sealed your fate in going to federal prison, because it could have been something fraudulent. You knew maybe that it didn't seem okay, but you didn't know how to push back. You're the sole breadwinner in your family. Your family needs these health benefits. You might have a sick child. You might have a stay-at-home spouse. You need this job. You're not going to rock the boat. That is the accidental perpetrator.
Yeah.
So there's stories in that chapter of the accountant, the lawyer that found themselves mixed into these types of situations. They didn't push back. They didn't say no. That could be any one of us. Any one of us.
It made me think of gray area too when you were talking about that, because a lot of people rationalize something as it's in a gray area. So it's not quite black and it's not quite white. Everybody's doing it. So what's the harm?
And this is the interesting thing, because if you are a professional, hold a professional license, there is no gray area. If you're a CPA, you're a JD, you're anything that holds a license, you don't get a gray area. You get black and white. You don't get, when you find yourself in the gray, the judge is going to put you in black and white. You're either going to jail or you're paying a fine, but there's no gray area for you. And so those are the stories that in cases that I use in class. When my students hear those, they're like sitting there like, oh my God, like this could be me. This could happen to me. Like, what am I supposed to do if my boss asks for my password to go in and change a transaction under my name? And I'm the newest employee. I'm the lowest on the totem pole. What do I do? Do I tell my boss? No.
Right.
Do I really do that? And you might really have to. That's the accidental perpetrator.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
And so there's numerous examples in the book about an accountant. And I can think of an accountant who was, depending on the kind of organization you work in, some people love their accounting group. Some people don't. A lot of people don't like their accounting group. They look at them as a nuisance, but you need someone to keep you grounded. And but sometimes the accountants will get a charge from the C-suite saying, we just need to get these numbers to work. We have a big transaction, make it work.
Yeah.
And you do it.
And you do it. And they don't, and they can say it's plausible deniability for them too, because they could say, I never said to do anything specific. I just said, hey, this is where we got to get to, right? So,
and Mike, what's classic is I'm not the CPA. They are.
Right.
They know the rules. I don't. I'm a sales guy. I didn't know.
Yeah,
They're the one that devised this. I just said, make it work. I didn't tell them how, because I'm not a CPA. Then you go to jail.
So from an example standpoint, I think there was an attorney in the book. And I don't know if it was Elise or Keila. One of them hired Kayla. Yeah. Okay.
That's my righteous chapter.
Oh, okay. All right, cool.
Go on. I want to hear what you're going to say. Ask about her, because we can go on to the righteous perpetrator chapter now.
Yeah, well, I couldn't remember whether it was her or there was one attorney who hired her husband to make copies.
That's her? Kayla.
Okay, so this was a legitimate need of the firm. They had some case going on that had lots of copying. They couldn't do it themselves. He could, and I guess had some kind of business that was set up. I can't remember exactly, but he started to do it, and it was working out fine. And then he stopped delivering the copies, right?
Yeah.
And then that created a problem for her because I think they had paid in advance or something. I'm not sure. So you take it from there.
You're doing great. You're doing great.
So the firm had paid in advance, and then her husband wasn't delivering on the copies, and that's where now she's stuck, right? And that's where my recollection ends.
Oh,
so you take it from there.
That's great. So what happened, as you eloquently said, she's stuck.
She's stuck.
And just think about, let's remove Kayla from the situation and put ourselves. We recommend a friend for a job, and we know this friend has a legitimate business, and we know this friend has done work for other friends before. We recommended a friend for a job, and we are the person that gets to oversee this contract. And we know the person, but we didn't let our partners know that we knew the person, that they were a friend, a good friend. Okay.
Yeah.
Sort of happens with referrals, right? So your friend's contract gets picked up. Your firm hires your friend, and your friend's doing the work. Everything's moving smoothly until one day your friend stops doing the work. And you go to your friend, you're like, hey, friend, I need you to get this done because you have my name is on the line. I vouched for you.
Right.
And you've got to get this done. And like we talked about earlier, we hire people that can fix problems. So I'm not going to let fraud happen on my watch with my friend. I'm going to be able to get my friend in gear. That was Kayla's thinking.
Okay.
My husband's going to do this. I'm not going to let my husband tank my firm and my good name.
Yeah. Right.
Now, the reason why Kayla's a righteous perpetrator is because Kayla was a star in her firm. She didn't need the money. She was an equity partner in a top law firm in New York City on Wall Street. She was rich. She didn't need the money. She was really just trying to help her husband.
And she wasn't damaging the firm either. It was a legitimate need.
It was a legitimate need.
Yeah.
It was a legitimate need. The problem was her husband stopped doing the work.
Right.
And when he stopped doing the work and started to submit invoices for work not done, that was a problem. But I will say this, and this, I can't remember if this is in the book or not. There was a policy that the firm that her department came up with saying, listen, we don't want to go back to our accounting group at the end of the fiscal year or calendar year and say, we didn't spend all of our money. So, hey, anybody have any outstanding invoices, please submit them so we can bring down this balance. Because the last thing we want to do is go back to the accounting group and say, we have a $50,000 surplus. Right. Because next year when we go back and put our budget in, they're going to reduce it by 50. Yeah, exactly. So this sort of process of submitting invoices before the work had been done was sort of the culture. Okay. So that being said, as her husband was submitting these invoices before work had been done, that was the culture. Okay.
All right.
Now, the culture was that work would eventually be done. Her husband didn't do the work. So Kayla started to find herself, okay, I'm going to approve these invoices with the expectation that he's going to do this work. He never did it. That led to a multi-million-dollar fraud scheme. I'm not going to spoil the whole story for you. There's some more little, but one of the things that I've noticed, and Mike, when I have talked about these cases live, what I do is I talk about an intentional perpetrator case, I talk about an accidental perpetrator case, and I talk about a righteous perpetrator case. And a lot of times I'll show video interviews with each of them. Intentional perpetrator, that's terrible. That person should rot in jail. They're awful. Okay. Accidental perpetrator, oh my God, that happened. Oh, I feel so bad for this person. Like, man, my heart goes out to them. That's a tough spot.
I can put myself in their shoes, right?
Righteous perpetrator, guys, that person really messed up. That person. There's a level of empathy that is shown to the other two categories that is not shown to the intentional perpetrator. So, if there is some way that I could do like brain scans of people as they're going through these processes, I'd love to be able to write that study, because just showing the emotional changes that people have as they are experiencing different cases and showing that these categories actually work. Another reason why I think that they're important is if you utilize them in a training workshop, it may give you insight on the types of internal controls you need, the type of employee support you may need to offer. Perhaps firms that have some type of employee support program where there's a fund that you can access if you are in a time of need. Maybe those types of resources could reduce someone from feeling like I need to take if I'm in need. Who knows? Just an idea.
Right.
But I think the categories matter.
And I think for the at least from the accidental standpoint, you tell me, but from a CPA standpoint and a control standpoint, that's in a company at least. Those are things that probably can be prevented if you've got the right controls in place, right? Absolutely.
And that is, Mike, you're taking the words out of my mouth. I'm sorry. Because what I did is, and I'll send this to you, and I don't know in your show notes if you want to use this, but I created a game called the Fool Me Once Fraud Experience. And you can, you log in and you can play two paths. You can either report fraud or you can commit fraud. And if you report fraud, it tells you what type of whistleblower you would be if you were ever to be one. If you commit fraud, if you do that path, it'll tell you what type of perpetrator you would be, whether it's going to be intentional, accidental, or righteous. So you go through these scenarios and up pops an answer. And then say, Mike, if you were ever to be a perpetrator, you would be a righteous perpetrator. What I've seen so far from the data the data I've surveyed, I should have about 6,000 responses at this point, is most people are trending on the accidental perpetrator and the righteous perpetrator categories, which is good because you can prevent that. If everybody's going to be an intentional perpetrator, we have a bigger problem. But what we're seeing is most people are showing that they are either, if they're going to commit fraud, it's either because they feel like they can't push back or they're trying to help someone. Both of those we can manage through training, through internal controls, which I think there's hope that we can change it.
Okay. So thank you for walking us through that. I'd like to spend a little bit of time on Rita, only because, as you mentioned, she's sort of a theme throughout the book. Plus, she's the star of your documentary, All the Queen's Horses. And so I don't want to, give away anything. I'm just curious how she's like, as I read the book, it seemed to me like she impacted you. It's almost like she got in your head, the way that she did things and all, and then of course the way that she was sentenced and then let out and stuff later. But she's like a special case for you. So there's like something personal there.
Well, it's interesting that you pose your question the way you did, because it's not so much that Rita impacted me.
Okay, it's
the environment that impacted me, because what was interesting to me after I saw the headlines that city comptroller embezzles millions and millions of dollars, my first question was, what's the environment that allows a person to think they can get away with that? Because I sort of believe we all will push the envelopes, but it's the rules around us that makes us say, no, I'm not going to speed, or no, I'm not going to use my corporate card and go shopping today. Like, it's the rules and the policies that that stop us. Right. Yeah. And so I was curious as to where is Dixon, and what in the world is going on in Dixon that a person thinks that they can steal that amount of money for that length of time. So it was more about the environment that I was intrigued by. Rita, to me, was just the product of the environment. Yeah, so, okay. And so you think about it, Rita is an intentional perpetrator. The residents of Dixon are innocent bystanders. And so that's the middle part of the book. The town of Dixon is an organizational target. That's another chapter. And then the person that discovered the fraud is a whistleblower. She's actually an accidental whistleblower. Yeah. So it's the entire case that really fuels the book. So Rita's at the beginning, but every player in this sort of fraud saga that happened in Dixon is a source of inspiration for me. But it was the environment that, when you hear these stories, once you get beyond the perpetrator, you start asking yourself two things. How was it discovered, and how did it happen? Yeah. How did it happen? I mean, if you think about it, the better movies that have been made about Bernard Madoff are about the environment, not really about his lifestyle. He lived a lavish lifestyle. He had a great penthouse. He had assets. He went to the best country clubs. That's not what's interesting. What's interesting is all the people that believed him. How did he get away with it? And who was the whistleblower that kept trying to alert everybody? That's where the story is. Yeah. So
it's like so everyone could see that something wasn't quite right, but everybody was impressed by the visual, right? And I think that's the same with Rita. It's like everyone's looking and going, how can this possibly be? But then they're like, wow, she's really crushing it.
And so let's sort of pull back the layers of that environment. And that's where my interest came from, because, Rita is remotely interested. She lived a lavish lifestyle. She bought horses and she spent a lot of money. That's the story. But the true story is, well, Dixon, when you all went to city council meetings, what was the environment of those meetings? What did she say? What did you all approve? What did the records look like that allow her to steal all this money? Because one of the first things we talk about in an accounting class is something called the accounting equation. Assets equals liabilities plus stockholders' equity. All these financial statements have to balance. So if you take $53 million out,
Right.
you are putting something in. So let's talk about, what did you put in? How did you pull the wool over everybody's eyes? To me, that was the story. And that was the story that the news was missing.
And then interestingly, Kathy Swanson is the accidental whistleblower in this.
Yes.
And what was so interesting about it is how quickly, if you just asked a simple question, like, let me see the bank statement, that you are able to essentially end this 20-year, $53 million fraud, like, in an instant. And it does make you wonder from a government standpoint or a leadership standpoint, because it could be a company, right? When you are completely asleep at the wheel and you are trusting somebody, whatever they tell you, when it's so easy for you to ask them to just, trust them, but just give me the bank statement, or give me the reconciliation or the general ledger or whatever, so that, or cash flow statement, where's stuff going, that at least I may not know how to be an accountant, but at least I know the questions I'm supposed to be asking. I mean, the mayor was beloved in Dixon, Illinois during this time, but I don't know what he was doing, but he was not doing anything to be fiscally responsible for his constituents.
And, Mike, you find this because for whatever reason, I don't get it. People don't like accounting. They don't think they need it. I don't know why that is, but every person should be able to read a financial statement. Everybody. Right. Because whether you work in a corporation or not, your tax dollars are rolled up into a statement of financial position. So every accounting affects everyone. So you should have enough knowledge to ask a question that's something like this. If our neighboring next door town, Sterling, doesn't have budget cuts, why do we? We're the same population size as they are. If their financial statement, if their balance sheet looks like this, or if their income statement shows this point of net operating income, why doesn't ours?
Right.
Explain that to me. You don't need to be a CPA to ask that, but you just have to have some basic knowledge. And nobody was asking those questions. That's what was interesting to me.
Yeah. And almost everybody who gets ripped off like that, Kelly, says something like this in the aftermath. I'm really not a numbers person, or
yes, you are.
I just never paid attention to the numbers. I'm focused on whatever, and you can't be focused on whatever if you have nothing on the numbers, right?
Yeah, and Mike, I try to talk to myself every day especially when I make a mistake or something wrong is going on, and I try to ask myself, what was my personal accountability in this?
Yeah,
and when you say things like, I'm not a numbers person, make sure you say it in the privacy of your own home, because whoever you say that around publicly, you're a target. Right. You are a target because the numbers person knows that you're not paying attention.
Yeah. Good to know. Can I handle your cash?
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Exactly.
Huh. So let's switch over to whistleblowers, because you spend a lot of time with whistleblowers, and not just the various types, but what their life is like, how people think about whistleblowers in general. And you kind of connect this thing that happened to you when I don't know if you were a teenager yet, but you were talking about your brother doing something, and you came to your parents and you wanted to tell on your brother, and your mom said something like, mind your own business. And as I was reading through the whistleblower section, I thought to myself, or maybe you even flat out said it, this is one of the reasons why it's so difficult to be a whistleblower, because everyone has been told, mind your own business.
Keep your mouth shut. It's none of your business.
Mind your own business. Yeah.
Right. And, and so we have an embedded culture of keep your mouth shut. This doesn't involve you. Right. And so it's hard to tell a person, come forward. And one of the things that, just like with the perpetrator category, we have different types. We have different types of whistleblowers too. And so I wanted to offer something sort of like a new way of thinking, because we have to stop grouping everybody together and thinking that they all embody the same characteristics. So with the whistleblowers, there's 3 categories: accidental, noble, and vigilante. Now I'm going to start with the vigilante first, because the vigilante category of whistleblowers is who we are actually describing when we say things like snitch, rat, tattletale, traitor, backstabber. Those are the vigilante whistleblowers.
Right.
And I believe that they are a rare breed. They are a rare breed of person that they don't mind their own business, but they're that employee that reads the code of conduct from top to bottom. And they know every rule, every policy. And when one person gets out of place, they know it.
Right.
Now tell me you don't want a person like that on your team. Of course you do. Of course you do. You might not want your whole team like that, but you need one person that reads the code of conduct, that reads the compliance report, that knows the standards and holds everybody accountable to them. That's a good person.
Right.
That's a good person. The next time you get on an airplane, you hope that there is a vigilante whistleblower on that safety and inspection team looking at everything. You hope that person's there because they know it cover to cover, and they're going to let you know if somebody's out of place.
Yep.
Okay. Vigilante whistleblowers tend to be somebody that is far more senior in their career. They are willing to fight. They can take the hit. They're ready for the war. They almost say, bring it on. I dare you because I know my stuff. I know my policies and I know you broke it and I'm going to tell. That's the vigilante. And so the terms, snitch and rat and tattletale, that's reserved for them and they're okay with it. They're okay with it because
there's
they
sort of
don't
a righteousness about them.
Yes.
Their own, right?
Now, the other two categories we might identify more with because we only get involved if we really have to. Now, the accidental whistleblower is Kathy Swanson out of my documentary.
Yeah.
Kathy Swanson did not target her boss. Kathy Swanson, doing her job like she always did every day, noticed some discrepancies, took those discrepancies to her boss. She stumbled upon it by accident. That's Kathy Swanson. Kathy never really identified as a whistleblower because she was just doing her job.
Right.
So why is that called a whistleblower? I'm just doing my job and I notice something odd and I take it to somebody. Why am I now in this category of whistleblower? Now, the noble whistleblower is a little bit different because the noble whistleblower, similar to the vigilante, what's different between the noble and the vigilante is the noble is a part of a team. The noble knows the process and knows that other people aren't paying attention to what they're supposed to be doing and speaks out. The vigilante may not have anything to do with the team. So that's the distinction between the two. And so going back to that safety inspection team, right. the noble whistleblower notices, hey, we're supposed to do a safety check on these engines for these cars. And I'm noticing that these engines blow up if they reach a certain temperature. And everybody on this team notices it too. And if we issue in the report what we saw, we're going to have to issue a huge recall. And it's going to cost the company millions. And there could be layoffs if we do this. You notice that other people don't say anything. And that could be risking lives of others. You're not going to do it. You're going to step out and say something. And when you do, people attack you because you've stepped outside of the group, but you've done the right thing. That's the noble whistleblower. So there are stories in the book that embody each of those categories. And the game will tell you which one you most likely would be if you ever were to be a whistleblower. Okay.
The example that comes to mind is the engineer from Morton Thiokol. I think he's a noble, right? He's
a noble. He's a noble. And you think about, if you remember the Space Shuttle Challenger,
right?
That could have been prevented easily.
Yes.
Easily. If they had listened to the science and the reports and the temperatures and all that the whistleblower had to offer, if they had just listened to him, that could have been prevented. It easily could have been prevented. And so when he stepped out and started talking about, Roger B. Jolet was his name, when he started talking about what happened and how no one listened, people attacked him. Why did they attack him? Because jobs were lost when that contract was lost in that town. So now it's his fault. It's his fault. It really isn't, and it wasn't, but he got blamed for it.
Yeah. Well, talk about selfish. I mean, there's people died as a result of this decision. And I know there's been a lot written about that particular thing, but it wasn't like he had this revelation or this knowledge that no one else had. They're all looking at the same thing, right?
They're all looking at the same report. They all know the same thing, and no one says anything.
Yeah. It was almost like the rest of them were like the accidental perps because the boss said, hey, this mission's got to go. And they made it go.
And why I wrote about that story, because you're right. A lot of people have written about this a lot. But why I wrote about that is because I had a personal connection when I was the commencement speaker at North Carolina A&T State University back in 2019. On the Space Shuttle Challenger was an astronaut, the second African-American astronaut in space, Dr. Ronald McNair. And of course, he died along with the other astronauts. But when I did that commencement speech and I posted the video, I think it was to LinkedIn, a man reached out to me by the name of Carl McNair. And so this man reaches out to me and says, you did a really great job. I'm so proud to call you an alum. And I noticed the name. So I write him back and I said, thank you so much, Mr. McNair. By any chance, are you the brother or related to Dr. Ronald McNair? And he writes back and he says, that was my baby brother. And I was like, oh, it's his brother.
Yeah.
And I'm like, can we please have a conversation? Can we please talk? So we talked and we had a call and he said, when I listened to your speech and I was really excited. And I said, when I was writing my speech, I thought about including the story about the Challenger. I had several iterations of the speech. And he said, wow, it's interesting that you say that because I've also watched your TED Talk. And had they only listened to the whistleblower, my baby brother would probably still be alive today.
Right. Yeah.
And so that's why I wrote about that, because that was just such a full circle moment. I remember watching when the liftoff, when it happened, and I remember watching when it blew up and did not understand what I was looking at. So I was so young and I was like, oh, wow, there's some balloon smoke that came out. I wonder if they intended that. That's what I was thinking, because you never would have thought something like that would happen. So yeah, that's why I wrote about that.
Okay. Well, that's powerful personal touch to that story. So thank you for sharing that. And that was really neat of his brother to reach out to you. And
it was, sometimes you never know who you're going to meet and touch. And so that's one of the things that I wanted to do with the book was make sure it had a storytelling approach and a character driven type of way to share these stories, as opposed to being more of these are the fraud schemes and these are the red flags. Right. And I didn't want to be like a recipe book. I didn't want to take that approach.
Yeah. It's not a manual. You did a great job of it being a story-based book, but getting enough into these things so that you can walk away with the understanding like, oh, okay, that's what happened. That's what this person was showing themselves to be, or grouping them into the intentional, accidental, righteous. You did a fabulous job. And it's the best, like the notes section that you can tell you're a professor because you definitely, you note your sources, you note everything in that book. Having written my own book with hardly any of that stuff, I thought, oh my gosh, so much work to do it that way.
I have to thank my editor, Kevin Evers. I have to give him a shout out for that, for making sure they were all there.
One more thing on the whistleblower, because you have some, Mark Whitaker comes to mind and you call him a crossover whistleblower, I believe, an example of a crossover whistleblower. And as I understood it, Mark Whitaker, I forget the name of the movie, but there was a movie that Matt Damon starred as this guy.
The Insider.
The Insider. Okay. So as I remember it, he works for ADM, which is one of the largest agricultural product producers in the United States. It's a privately held company. And they were doing some things inside of that company, and he was a part of it. But at some point, he's a really weird case because he was deep into something, benefiting from it. Then he got found out, but not from inside the company, from outside the company. But then I think he even went back to it before he decided that he was going to become a whistleblower. And I may have my facts a little bit wrong there, but the whole crossover thing, Kelly, is really interesting. If you could just describe what that actually is and what's going on with that kind of person.
Yeah, what I wanted to do was really make sure I had a place for people that were in the perpetrator category, that were involved in a fraud, but then became some form of a whistleblower.
Yeah.
And so what I wanted to do is not taint the whistleblower category with anybody that had fraud dealings. So that's why I put them in this crossover, because I wanted to make sure that people understood that there's value in perpetrators that cross over into a whistleblower category, because they are an extreme value to law enforcement, because they have inside information that can help the legal team, that can help the FBI, that can help the U.S. attorneys. And so they can become a vital source. So I wanted to put them someplace.
Yeah,
so that's why I called them a crossover.
Okay. And Brett Johnson, again, reminds me sort of a crossover. You get caught, and then the FBI or whomever, they say, okay, well, you start working for us to help us move up the ladder of this or throughout the broad, and then we'll help you with your sentence or your whatever we end up charging you with. So it's okay. Thank you for that. The one thing I want to leave, I just thought this was funny, so I hope you don't mind me leaving it, but these are Kelly's red flags. So I thought this is super funny. So these are things that Kelly considers red flags. One, you don't like dogs. Two,
oh my God, who doesn't like dogs?
Right.
Even cat
people like dogs. Yeah.
Indeed.
You refer to yourself in the third person.
Crazy.
It's happening more and more, though, isn't it?
It's odd. It's odd, Mike. It's really odd. Like, what are you doing? Distancing yourself from yourself? Like, why are you doing that?
What about one name? How do you feel about that?
I mean, are you a celebrity? Like, what are you thinking? I don't get that.
All right. Don't say please and thank you, which that's definitely a red flag for me.
You're too arrogant to work with, right?
Yeah.
Like nobody wants to be on your team.
Don't have a streaming account. I thought that was funny. And this one is the funniest. You have an email account that's a Hotmail account. My friend Todd has a Hotmail account. And I notice it every time it comes across me, because it's right? Like, what is it? Who has a Hotmail?
Listen,
Nobody.
A Hotmail, an AOL, an MSN, all sounds like fraud. All of it. Now, it might be completely legitimate, but that's what people are going to think. No one's going to click on and open your message if they see AOL.
Right.
Like, how long have you had that account?
Well, and people are like, AOL, is that still even a thing? I don't even know what that is.
They don't even know what it is.
Right.
Or Netscape. I mean, you can't have one anymore, but like all those kinds of things, bad signs.
Well, Kelly Richmond Pope, it's been such an honor and a pleasure to have you on the show. Your book, Fool Me Once, is a phenomenal book. I recommend it to everyone. You should go get it on Amazon right now, like probably hundreds of thousands of others that already have. And if you want to talk to me about it, feel free to reach out to me as well. Kelly, before we go, I just wanted to ask you if there's anything that I haven't asked you or something you want to leave us with that I forgot to mention, or the stage is yours.
Yeah, like any of us can get fooled, and many of us probably get fooled more than once. But hopefully the book will give you some insight to think about how you can protect yourself, how you can protect your organization, and never to help you think about schemes that you can use. That's not the point. Not the point for you to go and fool somebody. Don't do that.
There's a lot of examples, but that's not what you want to take away from this.
Yeah. So, but I appreciate the invitation and the really fun conversation today.
Great. Awesome. And if you don't like numbers, keep it to yourself.
Keep it to yourself.
Keep it to yourself.
You have a target on your back if you say that.
Right.
Don't say that.
So everyone, thanks for listening. I just want to leave you with this. Until next episode, please, every day, maximize the greatness that's inside of you and make your future your property, something that you are very proud to own. Hey, everybody. Thanks for listening to the show. And before you go, I just have 3 requests for you. 1, if you like what I'm doing, please consider subscribing or following the podcast on whatever podcast platform you prefer. If you're really into it, leave me a review, write something nice about me, give me 5 stars or whatever you feel is most appropriate. Number 2, I've got a book. It's called Owner Shift: How Getting Selfish Got Me Unstuck. It's an Amazon bestseller. And I'd love for you to read it or listen to it on Audible or wherever else, Barnes & Noble, Amazon. You can get it everywhere. If you're looking for inspiration that will help you unlock your greatness and potential, order or download it today so that you can have your very own copy. And if you get it, please let me know what you think. Number 3, my newsletter. I do a newsletter every Thursday, and I talk about things that are interesting to me, and or I give more information about the podcast and the podcast guests that I've had and the experiences that I've had with them. You can sign up for the podcast today at my website, which is my name, MikeMalatesta.com. You do that right now, put in your email address, and you'll get the very next issue. The newsletter is short, thoughtful, and designed to inspire, activate, and maximize the greatness in you.